New details in that fatal shooting earlier this week on Minot's northwest side. Police have identified the man who died as 34-year-old Davin Smith of Minot. Police responded to a residence on 7th Street Northwest between 1st and Central Avenues around 6 p.m. Monday. Investigators say the shooter stayed on scene and waited for police. That shooter was detained for questioning and said it was self-defense. No one has been charged yet, and the investigation into the incident is ongoing.